Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar on soil carbon and regenerative grazing. I'm Elizabeth Spratt, and I'm a Senior Program Associate with the Pasture Project at the Wallace Center, who's hosting this webinar today. To start us off, I'm going to go over some of the logistics and how-tos for the webinar system, and then I'll talk briefly about Pasture Project and what we do. And then we'll do some quick audience polling where some questions will appear on your screen. And after that, we'll get into our presentation with our presenters that we have here today, and then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for your questions at the end. So in terms of the webinar technology, you should see the GoToWebinar control panel on the side of your screen. You can maximize and minimize by clicking the orange arrow at the top. And you may want to use your control panel during the presentation, so it's best to keep it maximized. You can also click the small triangles below to open and close different parts of the panel, like the questions and chat pane. Everyone is in listen-only mode during this presentation to minimize background noise, but as you have them, please ask questions in the questions pane throughout the presentation. And these will be addressed after the presentation time during the Q&A time, but if you need clarification at any point or have technical difficulties, please do ask at any time. There will also be a short follow-up survey that pops up just after the webinar is over, and we really do appreciate if you take a minute to complete this. It helps us develop our future webinars. And just a quick note that if you're calling in on the phone, you will have more limited functionality. You won't be able to do polls or ask questions. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Pasture Project website and the Wallace Center YouTube in the coming week. So let's just talk a little bit about who we are as the Pasture Project. The Pasture Project is part of the Resilient Agriculture and Ecosystems Initiative at the Wallace Center at Windrock International. And we work to advance and integrate regenerative grazing as a scalable, market-driven solution for building healthy soil, viable farms, and resilient communities in the upper Midwest, and specifically in a 6-state region in the upper Mississippi River Basin, although we do work with some national audiences. Several of the strategies that we use to promote regenerative grazing are developing a data-backed and field-tested case for regenerative grazing, which we do through on-farm research with a number of on-the-ground partners. Another strategy is providing resources to producers for planning and changing to regenerative grazing practices in certain areas. We also help build an alliance of supporters for regenerative grazing so that together we can reach more folks in more places. And finally, we support shifts in political, financial, and other systems to support regenerative grazing as a widespread practice. So please do visit our website, pastureproject.org, or contact us for more information about our work. And we also plan webinars often based on requests that we get. And as I mentioned, that survey at the end has a spot for you to tell us what you want to hear more about next. So let's do some polling questions to help us get a feel for who's in the room. We will launch the first question to your screen, and you should be able to click on the most relevant answer. And then we'll close the poll and share the results. Cool, so the first question is about your primary role that you have in farming or livestock production. Livestock producer, row crop producer, mixed crop and livestock producer, agency, nonprofit, university, company staff, or a landowner leasing land for farming or grazing. Just pick the one that is a best fit. And also feel free, if your role isn't represented here, to throw it in the questions box. Great. Great. It looks like we have a majority of folks here who are primarily agency or nonprofit or university or company staff, but we have also a good mix of folks who are incorporating livestock on their with crops, as well as solely livestock producers, as well as a handful of landowners leasing land for farming or grazing as well. So it's great to see a variety of folks with us today. Great, we can move on to the second question. The second question is more about where you're at in your understanding of soil carbon. This is anonymous. It's just to help us get a feel for where folks are at in the audience today and what kind of level of information is helpful. So you can pick you really don't know very much and you're wanting more basic information, you know some or you know a lot and you're ready to get into the weeds. Great. Cool. That's interesting. We have most folks who are kind of in that middle category, as well as some folks who are knowledgeable. So I think we have a presentation today that will kind of hit all those buckets, but it's great that we have a really experienced group of folks with us today. Great. Great. So I will go ahead and introduce our presenters today. We have Dr. Jasmine Dillon, who's an associate professor of beef and dairy agroecosystems in the Department of Animal Science at Colorado State University. And we also have Dr. Megan Machmuller, who's a research scientist also at Colorado State University in the Department of Soil and Crop Sciences. We're really excited for you all to present today. They're supporting the Pasture Project in kind of informing our own understanding of soil carbon and helping some of our ag educator audiences understand it as well. And I just feel so fortunate that we're able to hear your expertise, to engage with your expertise today. So with that, I am going to hand control over to you, Dr. Dillon.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you also for the introduction. Thank you to everyone who is joining us today. Can you all see our presentation? Excellent. Just a second. All right. So thank you all for joining today. We've got a lot of content to cover, so I won't add anything more to those introductions. But our title of the presentation today is "All the Places Carbon Can Go, What Do You Need to Know as a Farmer?" And I saw that we have a pretty good farmer participation in this seminar, but we've also got some folks working with different agencies and things. And I think based on the background for all of you, we'll provide a good overview, good background, and then also bring you to some of the cutting edge thinking about soil carbon and soil carbon sequestration specifically. So starting with kind of the 30,000 or maybe the global view of soils, soil underpins many ecosystem services, which kind of puts it at the nexus of our grand challenges. And by grand challenge, I mean things that you probably have all heard of. Population is increasing. That population requires agricultural products for food, for shelter, et cetera. And so as production increases, we also have to find ways to reduce environmental impacts of that production. And so the soil and the ecosystem services that it provides underpin that need basically to both provision and to reduce those environmental impacts. And so soil contributes to ecosystem services everywhere from nutrient cycling to biodiversity to the focus of the presentation today, which will be carbon sequestration. Even the United Nations has recognized the importance of soil health specifically as being foundational to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So if you're not familiar with them, the UN has kind of organized these categories of areas that we need to focus in so that development, global economic development, proceeds in a sustainable way. Just a second. So that global development proceeds in a sustainable way. And so these categories cover environmental, economic, and social aspects of life. So everything from eradicating poverty and hunger to ensuring quality education for all, to environmentally sound management of chemicals and waste, and soils do underpin all of those things. In addition, particularly from the soil carbon perspective, soils are a climate solution. So in this figure that you're looking at, the years on the x-axis and carbon dioxide equivalent concentrations are on the y-axis. And what the figure is showing you is that since 1960, we've increased from about 350 parts per million up to somewhere around 450 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And if we were to continue emitting as we are currently, those emissions could climb. They could nearly double essentially by 2060, which is, you know, not too long from now. And so many scenarios have been proposed for how we can reduce emissions, and they require all hands on deck. And so soils have become a significant focus of not only nonprofits and governments, but also the private industry in trying to incentivize ways to capture carbon in soils. So globally, soils contain about 50,400 billion metric tons of carbon. And to give that a little bit of perspective, a metric ton is a little over 2,000 pounds. So that's a lot of weight of carbon in soils. And so carbon stores more, soil stores more carbon than vegetation and atmosphere combined. So ocean is the largest reservoir of carbon. About 77% of global carbon stores are in ocean, but followed by that is soils, which store about 5%. And then atmosphere and vegetation each store a little around about 1.5% of global carbon. And most of that carbon, like I said, is stored in soils. And so this graph is just showing you organic carbon in petagrams, and then the green shows you above ground carbon storage and above ground biomass, and then the red box shows you below ground carbon storage. What's alarming is that we've lost about 120 billion metric tons of soil globally. So this figure is just showing you from up to now, basically from no land use up to land use today. If you look at this black line, as land use increased over time, so too did soil organic carbon losses. And this is a reflection of conversion of grasslands into croplands, deforestation, etc. And just to give you a little bit more context on that, this figure is showing the intensity of soil carbon loss across the globe. So anywhere you see these red areas represents hotspots of soil carbon losses. And so you see that we've got hotspots in the Midwest where we've had lots of annual cropping, but also hotspots in Europe and China. But given that great loss, with the great loss also comes great potential. So we're looking again at kind of a emissions projection graph. This one goes from 2000 to 2050 and has global carbon emissions on the y-axis again. And so again, we're showing that increase from 2000 to about 2020 in carbon dioxide emissions, and then continuing to project this increase in emissions based on business as usual, or life as we conduct it today. In order to achieve the global target of limiting climate change to below 2 degrees Celsius, this green line is showing how emissions would need to change from today in order to achieve that goal. The area in between is showing opportunities for sequestering carbon to achieve the pathway delineated by this green line. So you see that a large portion of that pathway is a function of fossil fuel mitigation, but there is a significant portion that can be attributed to natural climate solutions, and that's what this NCS stands for. In fact, the study that was recently published in 2018 estimated that with a suite of natural climate solutions, we could offset about 20% of net annual US emissions as of 2016. So let's take a step down from that global view on carbon and think a little bit about the carbon cycle on the farm itself. Again, this isn't anything new to all of you, but I think it's helpful because we've been talking about carbon from big scale, and we're going to drill down into the soil as we go along in the presentation. So plants absorb energy from the sun, and that powers the carbon cycle. As they absorb that energy, they also consume carbon dioxide. Through photosynthesis, they release oxygen back into the atmosphere. Their root systems develop, and they feed billions of microbes every day, which support the plant in acquiring nutrients from the soil. These microbes also respire, releasing some carbon back into the atmosphere. Animals consume the plants that are supported by those microbes and grown in the soil. And then those animals release carbon back into the atmosphere through carbon dioxide, through methane, and through manure production. So what happens? How does carbon get sequestered into soil? And later we're going to talk about thinking about sequestration not only as getting carbon into soil, but keeping it in the soil. So how does soil carbon sequestration work? There are a few ways that soil carbon sequestration can work. First is increasing inputs. So through things like cover crops, manure, and composting, you could increase the amount of carbon that's actually going back into the soil. And you can also decrease outputs. So by switching to management practices that reduce or eliminate tillage, that reduce erosion, and that maintain cover on land, we can decrease carbon outputs, supporting the storage of carbon in soils. A combination of these two approaches is increasing the efficiency of soil organic carbon conversion. So this is a process that's happening in the soil. As that carbon makes its way into the soil, there are these plant microbe interactions. And those plant microbe interactions mediate the amount of carbon that stays in the microbial bodies, the amount of carbon that gets a chance to attach to soil particles, and the amount of carbon that gets respired back out as CO2. But this leads to a dilemma. And that's, again, like I said, the dilemma of how do we keep that carbon in the soil as opposed to just capturing it. And I'm going to turn it over to Meg to talk a little bit more about this.
Thanks, Jasmine. Can you hear me? Okay. So the soil carbon dilemma. So shall we hoard carbon or should we use it? Sequestering carbon in soils is often seen as a win-win proposition, but it not only removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but also can improve soil by augmenting the organic matter, which is an energy, a nutrient source for biota. But organic matter is the most useful when it decays. It's the most useful biologically when it's turned over and through the decomposition process. This is a major function, or this is very important to soil health. So we face a dilemma. Can we both conserve organic matter and profit from its decay? And this was proposed by Jansen in 2006. And it really drives home the point that soil carbon sequestration and soil health goals need to be merged. And perhaps now we should ask whether it is possible to encourage a suite of practices that encourage both of these, the turnover and the storage. Next slide. And so as scientists focusing on soil ecology and sustainability, we believe that managing soil carbon and soil health effectively requires taking into account its differences. Not all soil carbon is made equal. And one key distinction can provide an underlying framework for soil carbon management, and that is by separating soil organic matter into two different pools, the particulate organic matter and the mineral associated organic matter. And we abbreviate these as POM and MOM. And these various forms behave very differently and ultimately have very different impacts on plant growth, soil structure, and carbon sequestration. The key differences can fall under three categories. That is the chemical makeup, the physical state, and the nutrient content. Next slide. And so I'm going to walk through these key differences. The first being chemical makeup. So POM, what we describe as more vulnerable, and MOM, we describe as being more stable and persistent. They're composed of different material, like I said. So POM is the stuff that you can see in the soil. It's the fragments of roots and decaying leaves and organic matter. While MOM is composed of microscopic coatings on soil particles, so that chemically adhere to soil minerals like the clays in the soil, and they're derived mainly from microbial bodies and their byproducts. And so this intricate connection with soil minerals means that that particular organic matter or that carbon sticks around for a long time. So the lifetime is much longer than the particular organic matter, which cycles very quickly. So that's like the physical state. The physical state differs and the chemical state differs. But also, importantly, the amount of nitrogen, so organic matter is not just carbon. It contains other elements and, importantly, nitrogen. The carbon to nitrogen ratio of the POM and MOM vary. So MOM has a lot more nitrogen than POM. And so the POM nitrogen, for example, is readily available, and that's what produces plant available nutrients, whereas the MOM nitrogen is less available as plant available nutrients. Okay, One useful way or analogy of thinking of these pools is in terms of a bank account. So the POM is like the checking account. It receives money every payday through deposits like the leaves, the roots, and other decaying materials. So every payday, this is replenished, but it's also used much more quickly. So these withdrawals are a function of its accessibility. They're accessible to soil organisms for decomposition, and then they're returned to the atmosphere more quickly, so within a decade or so. On the other hand, MOM is more like the savings account. It usually receives less money from each paycheck, but that money gets it usually receives less money from each paycheck. The deposits, so for example, are smaller, like simple plant compounds and microbial waste, but the withdrawals are much slower. So unless there's a disturbance like tillage or plowing, this carbon can take centuries or longer to decompose. And so when humans face, for example, a big unexpected expense, they typically drain their checking accounts and may also dip into their savings accounts. And if this happens over and over again, eventually both accounts go broke. Next slide. So this framework is very useful, and separating the organic matter pools in this way into POM and MOM are really important to assess vulnerability to disturbance, the potentials for carbon sequestration to occur, and management strategies to accrue more and persistent carbon. Next slide. So carbon stocks don't allow us to project the additional carbon storage capacity when just looking at bulk soil carbon stocks. And instead, they can be better informed by separating into these two different pools. And the distribution of these two pools within your soil can help inform management strategies. So the storage of carbon in MOM dominates in soil. So let me orient you around these graphs first. So on the left-hand side is the mineral-associated organic matter on the y-axis, versus the x-axis remains the same. It's the total soil carbon. And on the right side is showing the POM. So at low carbon, on the left-hand side of that graph, indicated by the red boxes, at low carbon, MOM dominates. So there's a greater proportion of mineral-associated organic matter compared to particulate organic matter. But importantly, MOM saturates as soil organic carbon stocks increase, while POM can increase perhaps even exponentially. So at which point additional carbon storage is increasing to a point where MOM saturates, carbon accrual can only be realized through POM. So building up that POM pool. So these different colors of these dots show different ecosystems. So in blue, which is highlighted here, are grasslands. And grasslands contain a greater proportion of MOM than POM. Okay. But one more point, sorry, on that last graph is that an important point about the saturation is to realize that most soils are far below their saturation potential, especially in deeper soil horizons. So saturation is not necessarily a significant constraint to carbon accrual. Another point with MOM, realizing, remember what I told you about the stoichiometry, the amount of carbon compared to nitrogen in these fractions. MOM contains more nitrogen than carbon. And so carbon sequestration in grasslands, then, for example, that are predominantly or have a greater proportion of MOM, require a lot more nitrogen, and they saturate because require a lot more nitrogen to store carbon in these systems, just because of the function that more nitrogen is contained in the mineral associated organic matter, and grasslands contain more MOM. So the amount of MOM that can be sequestered is also dependent on soil clay content and how much carbon is stored in the clay. So this just shows the percentage of silt and clay in your soils compared to the amount of carbon in that fraction. And as you can see, as a percentage of silt and clay content increases, the potential to store carbon in this fraction, so this is the persistent fraction, is greater, which makes sense. There's more area, there's more minerals, surface area for that carbon to interact with. Okay, and another thing, so this study is a good demonstration of how particulate organic matter carbon is more vulnerable to disturbance than mineral-associated organic matter. So on the y-axis here, we have soil carbon content in the whole soil, and these are 3 different sites in Akron, KBS, and Whiteville. The different colors are the different carbon contents stored in POM, shown in yellow, and mineral-associated organic matter shown in blue. And this graph is showing native soil carbon stocks in each of these areas and comparing that to different management practices. So conservation tillage and conventional tillage just in the second graph, and a conversion of a native grassland to no-till implemented and conventional till implemented. And what you can see is that POM decreases more so than MOM, meaning upon the implementation of these different management practices. So again, POM is more vulnerable to disturbance than MOM carbon. Okay. And so grassland management practices have the potential to influence soil carbon accrual. This particular paper was a review of all of the studies that have come before, looking at different management practices such as fertilization, improved grazing, sowing legumes, earthworms, and irrigation and sowing grasses. And each one of these implemented alone contributed to carbon sequestration. And you can see that, for example, sowing grasses had the largest effect, while irrigation had the smallest effect. And so there's great potential for implementing these particular practices, and especially if implementing multiple at once, to enhance the amount of carbon stored in your soils. Okay. So this was a study that I did back during my PhD in Georgia, and this was a conversion of row crop agriculture that was primarily cotton farming to management intensive grazing dairy systems. And what we found was, upon this conversion and the implementation of management intensive grazing, rotational grazing practices, that these practices led to a large accumulation of carbon in the soils. And this right here was just taken just the top 30 centimeters of soil, and the differences deeper than that were less apparent. But these particular practices, and not only the conversion itself from row crop agriculture to grasslands, but also the implementation of this rotational grazing practice significantly enhanced the amount of carbon in the soils. And this carbon, of course, is part of the organic matter pool, which also has important benefits for soil health. So maintaining the cycling of that organic matter in the system. These, not only did we find a large accumulation of carbon in the soil, but we saw water holding capacity and other soil health metrics improve. Okay. So this is another another study that looked at adaptive multi-paddock grazing in the upper Midwest. So this was in Michigan and across several different soil types. And what they found, they also found the implementation of these practices was beef cattle. The implementation of these practices in this area also contributed to enhanced carbon sequestration rates. On average, 3.59 megagrams of carbon per hectare within that was an annual increase over 4 years. Next slide. So this adaptive multi-paddock grazing, this was another study that found that both the soil carbon and nitrogen stocks increased with implementation of AMP grazing compared to the continuous grazing. In this study, they sampled much deeper, and they found those differences, or that enhanced carbon sequestration, all the way down to 1 meter depth.
And I'll jump in here, Meg. Yeah, so something important that Meg just showed us is that not only was there this mean annual increase in soil carbon sequestration, but remember earlier she mentioned that more of the MOM is in the clay particles. There was also increased carbon sequestration in the clay loams as compared to the sandy and sandy loams. But something interesting about these previous studies where we looked at soil carbon sequestration is that they weren't able to or did not separate the soil carbon samples by MOM and POM. And so in this adaptive multi-paddock grazing system, there was an experiment actually done by Mosier, a student here, right, Meg, here at CSU, where they looked at the impacts of adaptive multi-paddock grazing on soil carbon and nitrogen stocks across a number of different sites, everywhere from Kentucky down through the Southeast and into Louisiana. And what they found is that in general, the AMP system did have increased carbon stocks over time than the continuous grazing system. So that kind of follows the previous results of the previous studies that showed this increase in soil carbon stocks with more management-intensive grazing strategies. But in this study, they also were able to look into changes in MOM and POM concentrations over time. So what you're looking at in this graph is MOM and POM concentrations in soil across depths. So first at the A horizon, then from the bottom of the A to 30 centimeters, 30 to 50 centimeters, and 50 to 100 centimeters. And for each group, AMP is the first bar and continuous grazing is the second bar. And what you'll see is across all of the depths, except for the bottom of A to 30 centimeter horizon, the AMP system had more MOM than the continuous grazing system. And so this suggested that AMP grazing at nearly all depths increased the amount of that protected long-term carbon in the soil. So it's important to note that while we're talking about organic matter sequestration and its role in the role of MOM in particular in keeping that carbon in the soil, nitrogen is essential to this process. So if you remember earlier, Meg mentioned that there's POM, which is that rapid turnover checking account that's made primarily of carbon with only a small amount of nitrogen. MOM, on the other hand, is the fraction of the organic matter where there's more nitrogen, a greater concentration of nitrogen than what there is in the POM. And that's an indication of the fact that nitrogen is needed in order to sequester carbon in this form. And again, that MOM form is the savings account. So when there's more N in the system, within reason, you have more efficient soil organic matter use, and this leads to more persistent MOM, or protected carbon in the system. So what was interesting was in this study, they also looked at nitrogen. Again, you're looking at AMP grazing as the first bar and continuous grazing as the second for both figures. The first figure is looking at carbon stocks and the second figure is looking at nitrogen stocks. And so not only did the AMP grazing system increase carbon stocks, it also increased nitrogen stocks in the system. And these are some of the early studies. I think you'll find that as we get into management practices, probably in the discussion, we're still learning a lot about how management directly impacts these mom and pom fractions across locations. So this is one of the early studies to delineate these differences in protected versus more vulnerable carbon under different management practices. So how do you measure that, Megan? Take it away.
Right. Yeah, so you might be wondering at this point, if you're interested in understanding more about these fractions in your soils, how do you measure them? And actually, there's no service lab that I'm aware of that currently measures these, but at Colorado State, we're just implemented and started accepting soils to measure these different fractions. So if you're interested, you can reach out to me and I will connect you with the soil testing facility. And we're really excited about offering these new tests. So essentially, you collect your soil cores, and what's important here, when you go out to sample your soils, and especially when you're interested in carbon accrual, soils can expand and the bulk density can change. And so you can build upon the soil that's already there with enhanced inputs. So understanding and separating your soil by different horizons. So the top horizon, the A horizon, by the B horizon, for example, by keeping those horizons separate and then separating by depth within those, you'll be able to track those changes of the expansion, the potential expansion of soil over time. So that's what we like to recommend, so that you're capturing those changes that would not be captured if you're just sampling by depth. And so to separate these fractions, when we take the cores back into the lab, you can separate them either by density or by size. Here, or both. And so, but what do I mean by separating by density? Essentially, you put your soil in a highly dense solution. And so what that does is it causes a split of the soil. So that literally, which is lighter, will float, and that which is heavier will sink. The lighter material is the palm, and the heavier stuff consists of the mom. And so the palm being like root fragments or leaf material, it makes sense that would float compared to the more dense material, the mom, which is connected to or stabilized by clay minerals. That stuff sinks. And so after that, then we separate it by size to specifically get at that clay fraction that is contains the most persistent carbon, carbon that will last the longest. And we're really excited for the development that of the Soil Carbon Solutions Center at Colorado State. We just formed this center this year, and it consists of faculty across colleges, the College of Agricultural Science, Engineering, the Warner College of Natural Resources, and Liberal Arts. So it's a group of not only soil ecologists, but engineers and social scientists and economists, because we recognize that soil carbon solutions are not just understanding the ecology and the cycling of carbon in the soils. It encompasses the economics, especially being very important, but it encompasses all of these fields. So to really tackle this as a solution, or to help offer advice for management, we need to think about this holistically. And so we're not only performing the research, but we're developing the tools necessary to implement management changes. Okay, you want to go over the takeaways?
So here's some key takeaways, and we're getting close to question time, so that's great. Kind of from a broad overview perspective. First, broadly, grazing management does have the potential to enhance soil carbon sequestration. But all of that soil carbon is not created equal, as Meg mentioned. Soil kind of accrues in two different pools. There's MOM, which is the savings account, that protected carbon. And then there's POM, which is the checking account, that more vulnerable carbon that turns over to provide nutrients to the plant. Grasslands accumulate more of their organic matter as MOM, which also, actually I'll mention that in a second. So grasslands accumulate more of their organic matter as MOM, while forests accumulate more of their organic matter as POM. And this MOM, because of its association with clay particles in soil, does saturate because of those physical constraints, while MOM can continue to accumulate carbon over time. In order to track these differences in your soil, you've got to take soil samples that are deep enough to cover multiple horizons. And currently, because we're not aware of another soil testing location that can and regularly does separate these fractions, you can take the samples and you can send them here to the Soil Carbon Solutions Center that Dr. Machmuller just mentioned, and get them tested for MOM and POM. And with that, we'd like to open up for any questions y'all may have. Our contact information is here on the slides, and I'll leave it there for a moment in case you want to jot down our emails. Please feel free to reach out with any questions for clarification or additional questions you may have. And with that, we'll open up to start taking questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you both for that presentation. I think it answered some of the questions that I have. And we do have just a couple questions coming in, but encourage folks at this point to start putting them into your questions into the questions box if you haven't already. One question is around sort of like, why do we hear about so much uncertainty and variability in carbon results from farm to farm and field to field, and how should people in the Midwest read studies like the ones you shared from the South or from out West?
I'll take the first part. So definitely there's a lot of variability around the response to management implementation and the effect of different management practices on soil carbon. And we showed you a few studies that showed carbon accrual, but definitely indeed, there are studies out there that show very little change. So this has to do with, first of all, soils are extremely heterogeneous. As you probably all know, you're walking in your field, you're taking a soil core, you walk, 5 feet over and you take a soil core and you compare them, they can look very different. So the heterogeneity on the landscape, even within one field, even within 10 feet from where you're standing, is extremely high. And so that's a big challenge in, first of all, detecting change. Second of all, the factors that which influence soil carbon sequestration or accrual are immense. So it depends on where you are, your climate, what can grow there, what is growing there, your productivity, and your soil type, for example. So all of these things, which vary across space, can influence soil carbon sequestration. So will one management practice happen that shows soil carbon accrual in one place? Will that happen in another place? Not necessarily. Will that even happen across the fence line? Not necessarily, because also importantly, regenerative practices are adaptive. And so, to be able to put a finger on which management practices exactly influence or enhance soil carbon sequestration is really difficult because of the complexity of these adaptive practices. And so also we're learning a lot more. I feel like the science is still in its infancy, and it will take more and more studies for us to hopefully really get a handle on what practices will enhance soil carbon sequestration and soil health in what locations. And so we're still getting there. Good question. And then there's a second part of that question, I believe.
think it was about how to interpret some of those studies from the West versus the Southeast. So I think Meg actually hit the nail on the head. You know, there are so many different factors. This is why I think when you read studies like this, they give you ideas of what the potential is. But ultimately, if you're interested in your particular farm in your region, you've got to take samples from your farm and participate when you can in research studies that are trying to take samples from working operations and track some of these changes over time. And actually, there are a couple of good ways that you can do that if you want to partner with researchers to do it. There are the Western, or not just Western, the Sustainable Agriculture and Research grants. There are ways to partner with your local NRCS representative, with the local university to actually implement some of the things you're interested in implementing on your operations and then track changes in soil carbon there. And then all you have to do is say, hey, we've learned about this new separation technique from CSU. How do we do it? And there's one outlet for you. The other thing I want to mention or just clarify is that the AMP grazing study was in the Midwest. It was specifically, or actually, I guess it was, there was one in the Midwest and then one through the Southeast. Yeah. So I think the question asked about the West, and we didn't have an example from our part of the West where we have no water. So
Yeah.
that the weather, the climate is also going to be a significant influence on how quickly and the quantity of accrual you'll see with areas with higher rainfall seeing more accrual than, or faster accrual than areas with lower rainfall.
Yeah, that's great. And we're getting a lot of questions that are coming in, kind of focused on sort of the spectrum of regenerative ag practices. You know, there's some folks who are more interested in more detail on reduced tillage and cover cropping. And then there's also some folks who are interested in more discussion on AMP grazing. So I'm wondering if you guys could talk about the POM and MOM breakdown, any differences between some of those and total sequestration across some of those different practices in the sort of larger regenerative ag practice pool.
You want me to take it, Meg? You want me to start
Go
us
ahead.
off on
Yeah. I'll follow.
Okay, so Meg is the resident soil carbon expert here. I just like cows. So if I say anything incorrect, you can jump in, Meg, and clarify for me. So this is always a question we get, and one of the challenges of answering the question is that the analyzing soil separated by MOM and POM is such a new technique that it does not exist yet in many scientific studies where we can actually say, oh, combining cover cropping with reduced tillage increases MOM specifically versus POM. But if you remember, there was a figure that we showed that I could pull up if there are enough questions about it, where we showed that, okay, there's a suite of practices that results in increased soil carbon sequestration in general. And so reducing tillage, cover cropping theoretically would contribute to increasing that soil carbon, but we don't know for sure what fraction of that would be in MOM and what fraction would be in POM. From kind of a practical interpretation standpoint, one of the things that I think about is once you've kind of accounted for some of the factors like the amount of clay in your soil, some of the climate differences and things, many of the soil health principles get at things that would increase soil carbon and potentially keep it there in your soil. So one of the things I always say is whatever you can do to focus on keeping that living root in the soil year round. So if you're grazing, thinking about rotation strategies like AMP that give the land time to rest, irrespective of whether you're rotating on Thursday, rotating on Wednesday, going clockwise or counterclockwise, whatever you do that allows those plants to rest and develop an extensive root system is going to facilitate the microbial activities that you need. Those roots are going to be feeding the microbes that are driving the processes that Meg described for MOM formation. So focusing on that idea of keeping the living root in the ground and minimizing the disturbance of that root in the soil is going to foster soil carbon sequestration and hopefully more of the MOM, but we can't say for sure how much MOM versus how much POM.
Right. It's totally context dependent. Just one more thing. Context dependent and hard to predict and because of that. But like Jasmine said, the soil, generally the 5 soil health principles, and she mentioned a few, will enhance your organic matter content, enhance soil health, and maybe in the long term, you will see the benefits for soil carbon sequestration. But again, it can take time. It's not necessary. You might see soil, you're likely to see soil health benefits before a ton of carbon can be sequestered. But the accumulation of carbon, especially depending on where you are, will take time.
I think one more thing I want to highlight that you said, Megan, is also that this is an adaptive process, right? So if you've been using cover crops and using reduced tillage in the same field for 10 years, the rate of accrual and the quantity of accrual may look very different than if you were going from a conventional tillage, annual crop for a long time system to a recently converted to reduced tillage type of system, and then going from that reduced tillage type of system into maybe incorporating perennials into the mix. You're going to see differences. You're going to see, can I say, Megan, a greater rate of change, basically, if you're continuing to adapt to the responses that your soil is giving you, than if you pick one practice and stick with it for the rest of the time that you manage the operation.
Right. Right, and you bring up a good point. What was shown in the study in the Southeast, the one that I performed in the dairy farms with the rotational grazing practices, I believe why we saw such a big change in that system was because we were starting at nothing. These soils had been cultivated for years and years and years, and the organic matter content and soil carbon content was extremely low when we started. So putting grass and maintaining productivity nearly year-round there in the Southeast can have a significant effect much faster than, let's say, a piece of land that had been in grassland previously, and you're just changing the management regime. So the magnitude is very dependent upon where you're starting in the previous land use history, for sure.
There is one follow-up question more on the practice side, which is about forage maturity and longer rest periods. Is it true that carbon sequestration goes faster with grazing less mature forage?
Oh, Meg, do you want to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay, so the question is it true that carbon sequestration happens faster grazing less mature forage? So this is one of those things that's dynamic, right? So let's say you're growing orchard grass and it's the spring, so orchard grass is exploding on your operation. I have to be careful because there's so much going on here. There's time, there's removal, there's, how long has it been since you seeded this? But basically, you're trying to find a balance between allowing the plant to mature, grazing the plant to stimulate some more growth and then root die off, but also maintaining productivity and profitability of your operation, right? So I'm just going to mention that on the side. But so there's a balance there. So it's not that you want to come in and hit that orchard grass, every week, but it's not also that you also don't want to go to the other end and just graze it only when it's seeded, and then now you've got to buy in feed to support whatever your productivity goals are, so that you can keep your farm because your bottom line. So I wouldn't say it's either or, it's a combination of the two.
Yeah.
Does that answer that question? I guess we'll see if we get a follow-up to it. And Megan, do you want to add anything to it?
That's great. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. I think we have a couple of other questions that are coming through around soil testing and sending it to the Colorado State Lab. So one is, how might I take a proper soil sample with every horizon? Do I dig a small pit and take a bit from each horizon? So we'll maybe pause with that one first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess it might require talking about the system, your management practices, and what your goals are. So depending on the size of the land, I feel like one of the most important things is to get enough samples that capture that potential heterogeneity that exists across your landscape. And so taking multiple soil cores at different parts of your farm, different locations. And so we can talk about, you can definitely contact me and we can have a further discussion about what makes the most sense, given the size of your land, your operations, and your particular management strategies. And then ultimately, what's your goal? And so there's, there's definitely carbon markets that require verification. And so if that is something that's of interest to you, then sampling might look a little different because you have to meet all of these criteria in order to be verified. And so we would have to take some of those things into consideration when trying to determine your sampling regime. But hopefully, I mean, this literally as of last week or 2 weeks ago, we started to offer this service. And so this is very new, but it would be great to communicate with you more, because ultimately what we'd like to do is create sampling guides, or guides to help you determine what is best for your operations, how best to sample, how many samples. And so that's definitely something that we want to do, and it will require working with you all and communicating with you all to see what your needs are, to figure out what sort of operations or producers or to help you sample and do that. Yeah.
Great. A follow-up question is how much it costs to get your soils tested at Colorado State.
Yeah. We're also working on that. Like I said, this is like really fresh, like within the last couple of weeks. And so we have a new director. So the CSU soil testing facility is going through a big revamp right now, and this is one of the things. And so we have a new director, and she's working on that. And so hopefully the prices will be published online soon. But you can definitely feel free to reach out to me as well, and I can put you in communication with her. And also the facility is moving from the proper CSU campus, the main campus in Fort Collins, to the new National Western Center in Denver. And so there's also a move, but that comes along with all the new instrumentation that is needed to do these particular measurements as well. But at the time being, we're building up this program slowly on at our campus, so that researchers like me and others can work hand in hand with the soil testing facility to develop these, the protocols and the train the people to measure these pools. Because, like I said before, until now, it's only been done in research labs. So we're really excited to now offer this as a service. But it's in baby shoes.
Great. Well, it's exciting to hear about, and judging from the comments and questions, there's a lot of interest in it. So it's super exciting. I think we're gonna have to wrap. We weren't able to get to all of the questions, but there were so many great questions and comments. And what I'll say, I'll just plug really quickly, is that we're working with both Jasmine and Megan on a paper that documents a lot of what they talked about today and more about the ongoing debate and discussion around soil carbon sequestration and grazing. And so that'll be coming out here in the next month or two, and we'll be sure to send it to all of you. So we really appreciate everyone's time today, and just want to encourage that everyone does fill out the poll at the end of the webinar to give us feedback. It helps us keep giving free webinars and also helps us design future webinars. So again, thank you all for attending, and a huge thank you to Dr. Dillon and Dr. Machmuller, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.